Many believers today operate from a posture of quiet survival. The typical mindset involves holding down the fort, staying inside a building, and hoping to outlast a hostile culture. The original texts describe a different posture. The defensive stance, often seen in modern religion, stems from a specific linguistic shift in how these foundational documents are read. Three ancient Greek words shaped the development of Western Christianity, and their translation choices determine how a believer views their role in the world. Examining the original Greek vocabulary reframes these texts. They suggest that the movement Jesus started was far more active than a passive refuge, and that leaders like Paul viewed their commitment as something more absolute than a casual volunteer position. To find the original strategy, we have to bypass the English translations and look at the vocabulary of the first century. This investigation begins in Matthew 16:18. This is the moment Jesus announces exactly what he intends to construct. Modern English Bibles translate his words as, "I will build my church." That English word traces back to the Greek kuriakon, which describes a physical building belonging to the Lord. However, Jesus actually used the word ecclesia. In the Greco-Roman world, an ecclesia was a summoned assembly of citizens, gathered specifically to conduct the governing business of the city. Translating ecclesia as church moved the focus from an authoritative governing body into the context of a weekly religious meeting. The followers of Jesus were commissioned as a called-out governing assembly, meant to carry authority into every institution and nation. This shift in identity changes how we read the rest of the verse, "And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." This is frequently read as a promise that a defensive church will not be defeated by an outside attack. Tactically, a gate is a static structure. It has no offensive capability. It exists only to defend a fixed position. Jesus described his assembly advancing on the fortified positions of hell, promising those defensive gates would fail against their progress. The keys of the kingdom, the power to bind and loose, represented the legislative authority granted to this assembly to dismantle these strongholds. The ecclesia was built as an advancing force designed to break through enemy fortifications, replacing the mindset of a survivor with that of a victor. An advancing force requires a specific commitment. To see what this looked like in practice, we look at how the Apostle Paul described himself. English Bibles typically use the word servant. This suggests a working arrangement where an individual serves when it aligns with their own plans, retaining personal rights. Paul used the word doulos, which meant someone who was owned. A doulos had no personal rights over their time, over their future, or their possessions. In Romans 6, Paul presents a binary choice. There is no neutral ground. You are either a doulos to sin or a doulos to righteousness. True freedom within this advancing force is found through a total transfer of ownership to a master whose will is better than your own. These two archetypes operate on conflicting logic. You cannot live as a consumer within a building and expect to function as a governing assembly. Maintaining the personal rights of a casual servant prevents you from becoming the doulos required for this mission. The choice is to remain in the familiar patterns of modern religion or to accept the transfer of ownership required by the ancient plan. Believers are on the advancing side of a victory that has already been decided. If you are ready to abandon a defensive posture and join this advancement, type "advance" in the comments.
Welcome to this explainer. Listen, what you're about to hear today, it's not your typical dry historical review. We're actually unearthing a buried narrative here. For centuries, this modern, passive idea of church, just a building you attend, a service you sit and observe, has completely masqueraded as the original design. But when we actually look at the sources, they reveal something far, far more intense. What we call church today is literally the domestication of an ancient subversive battle strategy. And discovering this truth, it changes absolutely everything we thought we knew about history, power, and our place in the world. So let's dive into this hidden history.
Think about this. What if the word church was never actually meant to be a building? The staggering truth we've uncovered in these linguistic and historical sources is that the English word church is actually not the word Jesus used. Not at all. When he spoke of what he was building, he deliberately chose a word that carried the immense weight of empires, armies, and sovereign authority.
Here's how we're going to map this out today. First, the Great Mistranslation. Then, a declaration of war. Third, shadows of Sinai. Fourth, sedition against the empire. Fifth, the Constantinian domestication, and finally, the unfinished war. Let's get right into it.
Part 1. The Great Mistranslation. A domesticated word.
To truly understand what was lost, we really have to examine this centuries-old linguistic shift that completely rewrote Western Christianity's identity. We're looking at how a razor-sharp weapon was basically melted down into a comfortable, domesticated institution. For centuries, this profound mistranslation has just been hiding in plain sight. Take the Greek word kuriakon. It literally means a building belonging to the Lord. It's a passive place, a place you just attend. Over centuries, kuriakon evolved. It became the Scottish kirk, the German Kirche, and eventually our English church. But here's the catch. Jesus didn't use kuriakon. He used the word ecclesia. Ecclesia is an active political body. It's a called-out governing assembly. He deliberately chose a word of total mobilization, not a piece of real estate.
So, what exactly is it? Well, ecclesia is a compound of ek, meaning out of, and kaleo, meaning to call. But if you were an ancient Greek hearing this, you wouldn't think of a spontaneous crowd or some religious club. No way. To them, it was a formally summoned governing body. This was a fierce, unrelenting summons. Back in ancient Athens, a herald would literally stand in the streets and blow a trumpet to call the citizens. You didn't casually check your calendar to decide whether to attend. This was a mandatory mobilization to govern. And if you ignored that call, you faced severe penalties.
Moving on to Part 2. A declaration of war. The Greco-Roman War Room.
We're stepping right into the Greco-Roman war room now. You see, in the classical history of Athens and Sparta, the line between civic governance and military action, it simply didn't exist. To be a citizen was to be a soldier, period. In ancient Athens, your political voice was literally paid for in blood. Solon's census classes completely dictated this. Your right to vote in the ecclesia was inextricably tied to your military liability. The senior officers, the cavalry forces, the heavily armed hoplite infantry, their political authority in the assembly was entirely earned by their battlefield status. The ecclesia was the very body that voted on war, mobilized the troops, and held generals accountable.
Keep this historical truth in mind. The assembly of citizens was, in times of crisis, the assembly of the army. Historical records like Xenophon's 10,000 vividly demonstrate this intense reality. When 10,000 Greek mercenary soldiers suddenly found themselves marooned deep in hostile Persian territory, completely surrounded by enemies, their generals stripped from them, they didn't panic, and they absolutely didn't surrender. Instead, what did they do? They formed a mobile ecclesia right there in the field. They voted, they appointed new commanders, and they fought their way out. The ecclesia literally functioned as a sovereign democratic army fighting for its absolute survival. And guys, that is the exact word Jesus chose.
Part 3. Shadows of Sinai. The covenant mobilized. Now, the Greek world wasn't the only context for this ancient weapon. Centuries before Jesus, Jewish scholars translated the Hebrew Old Testament into Greek, creating what we call the Septuagint. When those translators needed a precise Greek word for the Hebrew kahal, which was the mobilized army of Israel marching through the wilderness under God's command, they chose ecclesia. The Old Testament assembly was essentially the shadow. It was geographically centered at Sinai, bound by law and bound by animal sacrifices. But the New Testament ecclesia, that's the substance. It's constituted by Christ's once-for-all sacrifice, with a charismatic center wherever 2 or 3 are gathered in His name. It's this unbroken, epic trajectory of a mobilized people, shifting from a physical nation to a spiritual vanguard. Part 4. Sedition against the empire. The subversive gathering.
By using the word ecclesia, Jesus was doing something breathtakingly dangerous. He was resurrecting a concept of sovereign assembly that the Roman Empire had explicitly stripped away and suppressed in all its conquered territories. As the sources point out, the crime was not belief, the crime was assembly. Rome was a vast polytheistic empire. They tolerated hundreds of different gods. They honestly didn't care what conquered peoples believed in the quiet privacy of their own minds. But they violently and ruthlessly persecuted early Christians. Why? Because their ecclesias functioned as unauthorized governing assemblies. They were pledging absolute ultimate allegiance to a lord other than Caesar. To gather in this specific way was considered an outright act of treason.
Just look at what happened in 155 AD. Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was arrested and threatened with wild beasts and fire. The Romans told him simply to acknowledge the fortune of Caesar and he could save his own life. But his response echoes with absolute defiance through history. How can I blaspheme my king who saved me? Notice the specific vocabulary he uses there. He didn't just call Jesus his religious savior, he called him his sovereign king. and for this unyielding political defiance, he was burned alive.
Or consider the strategic, intensely militant mindset of Ignatius of Antioch. In 107 AD, this man was being marched in heavy chains across the empire by a brutal guard of 10 Roman soldiers, heading straight for his own execution in the blood-soaked sands of the arena. Yet, he wrote to the believers, "When you assemble frequently, the powers of Satan are overthrown." Think about that. He viewed the literal act of gathering the ecclesia not as some comforting support group for the condemned, but as a devastating offensive weapon of spiritual warfare that actively dismantled enemy powers.
Part 5. The Constantinian Domestication, Absorbing the Threat.
So this brings up a huge question. If the ecclesia was such a dangerous, counter-governmental force, a true spiritual phalanx, how on earth did it become so tame? How did we arrive at the passive reality we see today? Well, in the first century, the ecclesia was this seditious, mobilized assembly. But then, in 313 AD, Emperor Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, which suddenly legalized Christianity. By the end of the 4th century, it had actually become the official state religion. And slowly, that explosive Greek word was diluted into the Old English "serch," meaning church. You see, Constantine didn't destroy the ecclesia with weapons. He neutralized its subversive edge by simply absorbing it directly into the Roman government.
This transformation was entirely architectural and structural, completely physically neutralizing the threat. Bishops were suddenly granted the power and the luxury of Roman magistrates. The physical buildings where they gathered, they were built in the exact shape of imperial Roman law courts, which were called basilicas. As the congregation began to just sit silently in rows while professionals performed rituals up at the front, the entire political and military weight of the ecclesia was completely drained away. Believers were just left with the passive, domesticated concept of kyriaka.
Which brings us to our final section, Part 6, The Unfinished War, a Colony of Heaven.
Here's the incredible thing, though. The original text of the New Testament, it never changed. The original orders are literally still sitting there, waiting to be read. The true meaning of the word is still buried deep in the ancient Greek, and its implications for us today are absolute. Consider the Apostle Paul's radical claim to the Philippians. He told them their citizenship was a palatema. Now, a palatema is a commonwealth or a colony. It's a very precise term that was used to describe a community of citizens living in a foreign, adversarial city who operates strictly under the laws of their home country, meaning the ecclesia operates as an outpost in occupied territory. Sure, they paid Roman taxes, but they were governed by a totally different, vastly higher constitution.
For centuries, the most famous promise of Matthew 16 has been viewed as this defensive refuge, just trying to survive a brutal attack from hell. But really think about it. Jesus said the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Let me ask you, does a gate attack? No, a gate is a stationary defensive structure. The reality here is far, far more aggressive. The ecclesia is an advancing army, actively battering down the fortified gates of the enemy. You are not meant to be a survivor cowering behind a wall. You are meant to be the invasion force.
To operate in this vanguard, the ancient texts point to very strict military orders, found in 1 Corinthians 16:13. Watch, meaning strict vigilance against night ambushes. Stand fast, anchor your position when you are under heavy fire. Be men, which is a literal command for absolute courage against overwhelming odds. And be strong, continually increase your operational capacity. Let's be real, these are not gentle suggestions for weekend gathering. They are uncompromising commands meant for a disciplined, advancing spiritual phalanx.
But you cannot join these ranks casually. The Apostle Paul introduced himself using a very specific, incredibly heavy word, doulos. Now, this is often softly translated as servant, but a servant in the ancient world had rights. They retained autonomy. They could literally quit when things got too difficult. A doulos, however, that represented a complete, irreversible transfer of ownership to a master. Operating in the ecclesia requires being completely owned by the king, body and soul. There is absolutely no neutral position in this war. There is no convenient, part-time participation.
So, I leave you with this heavy thought. Are you living as a citizen of his kingdom, or are you just a tourist in a passing empire? The ecclesia was never meant to be a weekend hobby. It is a literal declaration of war. It's a sovereign assembly, a mobilized colony of heaven operating right here in occupied territory. The protocol has been unearthed. The real question is, what are you going to do with it? Thank you for joining this explainer today. Keep learning and stay vigilant.